Okay, can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, great. Um, Welcome everyone to Speedwell Live. Speedwell Live is three of us. It's me, Charlotte Murphy. I'm on a little farm in Maryland, and I'm working with Jocelyn Lee, a great photographer and the head of Speedwell Projects in Portland, Maine, along with Bill Roebuck, a really great writer as well. And we just wanted to do something during the pandemic, and we wanted to use what we love the most, which is art and artists, to reach out and touch people. That sounds a little goofy, but it's just true. We just felt like it was really the time to feel compassion and intimate with our friends and others. So we wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for Speedwell Projects, because they're our engine, they're our home. And if you're possible, if you could donate a little bit to Speedwell Projects, or more than a little, that would be wonderful. And I'm presenting tonight a really wonderful friend from a long time ago, Stuart. And I was very, very lucky to get to see his film at the Hirshhorn in November before everything closed down. And I'm pretty sure that Stuart was not able to finish his theatrical release. Am I right?
Well, the last thing we did was in New York, which was at the end of February at the IFC Center. And that was pretty much the end of our theatrical run. There were some other things that we were going to do, like music festivals, but that was pretty much, yeah, I feel really fortunate that we got to do as many screenings and all that as we did. Yeah.
Okay, so Stuart is the writer, producer, and director of Desolation Center. And we also have Mariska Leyssius, and she is the co-producer, and she was also part of these incredible events in the desert, performance art and music that happened in the 80s in the desert that Stuart put together. And the movie itself, if you were able to get to see it, I'm just curious, how many people were able to stream it? I just, oh great, I'm so happy about that. That's so wonderful, okay. So you know, it's a completely unsentimental view about what makes something incredible happen. And it was really Stuart's vision and his ability to bring people together to work together that created these events that are now legendary. I think I went to LA, I think in the first time for me in '86, and people still talked about them. They talked about, I mean, and then I met Stuart and I was like, well, I know Stuart.
I know that, yeah.
So I'll give you a little bit more about, and we're very, very lucky. Joining Mariska and Stuart is Byron Coley, and he's just encyclopedic in his knowledge and his actual experiences of American music, and he's a critic for Artforum, Wire, Arthur. Stuart Swezey began his creative career organizing Desolation Center events. He's the founder of Amok Books, and he was the producer of the acclaimed feature documentary, Better Living Through Circuitry. And Mariska Leyssius, she began her creative career as a photographer, musician, and pioneering zine publisher, Contagion, in the LA punk and industrial scene. Her photographs make up a big part of the movie. So the photograph we used was taken by Mariska, but also it's just, and when she speaks in the movie, it's like the truth. There's something very deep about the way you speak, Mariska. And so.
Whiskey.
Whiskey, it helps. And then we have just this wonderful evening ahead of us, a deep dive discussion. And streaming the movie is going to happen at some point. And when that does happen, Speedwell Live will make sure we announce it to our friends, okay? So I'd like to turn it over to Byron. And please feel free to share questions, comments in the chat space. And Byron's going to make a great effort to share them all and weave them into the discussion. Okay.
Yeah, so again, I'm Byron Coley, and if anybody does have questions, there will be a Q&A later, but if you want to work stuff in and put it in the chat comments, I'll try to read them and get them in if I can. I've known Stuart for a while. I don't really know, I've never really met Mariska prior to this, but what I'm curious about is where did all this material come from and why was it laying around for so long, unused?
Well, you know, I was talking to someone about this actually today about, you know, because there's different versions of it. One is the fact that, like, I knew some things were filmed, but wasn't able to get the footage. And then I knew that, like, Mariska was a friend and a photographer, and I knew she had photos, but I didn't realize how much was out there. And I think part of it was like, by us getting the ball rolling, we started reaching out to all these people, and so some of it is just basic kind of like the detective work you do to make a book or make a film or whatever. But some of it also, I think, was the kind of the media landscape of now, is that all of a sudden I was looking at YouTube and there was Joy at Sea. Like, I didn't know anybody had videotaped the Minutemen and the Meat Puppets on the boat. And then turned out there's this guy, Eureka Mike, who had the footage and he digitized it. He was working for SST, I guess,
Right,
technically.
yeah.
But I mean, or they brought him in to shoot it along with, I think, Dave Travis. Anyway, so a lot of it was us just starting to like do things like putting together a Facebook group and posting some of Mariska's pictures. And then we did an art show down in Pedro, actually, with Craig Ibarra and Lori Steelink. And then, for instance, Naomi Peterson's brother found out about that. And all of a sudden we're like, okay, now we have access to Naomi's pictures that I didn't even know existed of Red Cross out there. And,
yeah,
you know, she shot Sonic Youth in the desert. So it's been a process of, like, the more that we did and put stuff out there, kind of the more we got back, but also just tracking people down, you know.
So Mariska, you were documenting all this stuff with any idea or just like taking pictures? Was that your?
It was weird back then. I had my camera with me all the time. I mean, I know now everybody does because it's on their phone, but
Right.
you know, then, you know, a week later you would go pick up the film and then you'd put it in a box and there it was.
Yeah.
And then when Stuart wanted it, I had to look through the boxes and I did find them. So.
Did you do a lot of other, like just a lot of photography back then? Was it mostly musical stuff or was it other kinds of things?
It was mostly bands. Maybe it was a shield. Like when I would go out, I would get, you know, cover up any social anxiety, just have my camera there, just take pictures.
But you were playing music as well at that time, right?
Yeah, I was in noise bands, which I liked, and then with Brad Lehner, you probably know him.
Sure. Yeah.
Back then, you know, everyone was in a band. I wasn't really a musician, so.
Right. But so did you play? Now, Stuart, you were doing Desolation Center shows before this sequence of outdoor events, right?
Right.
Down in downtown LA?
Yeah, so the idea was that it was kind of like a nomadic space or something like that, where we could put on the bands that we wanted to see, make it very affordable, and just scrambling to find a space, you know, whether it be a loft space in downtown LA or a rehearsal studio that I think Mariska turned me on to, Hully Gully Studio by the LA River. And
Right, yeah, Robin Amos ran it, right?
Yeah, Robin.
Yeah.
So, but everything would get shut down. And also, so it was a two-part kind of a thing. But, you know, I had friends, I was a big fan of certain bands, whether it be the Minutemen or people that I went to high school with, you know, Lot 6 or whatever. And so then it was like, well, how can we put on shows? And also, I felt like there was some other sensibility besides just going up to the Sunset Strip, going to the Whiskey, the Starwood and all that, that I felt like there could be something kind of more austere and kind of just away from all the rock and roll trappings that come with LA. But also I have to give credit, there's a guy named, he's no longer with us, Jack Marquette, who ran a place called the Brave Dog. I don't know if you ever went down there, but it was in Little Tokyo, like next to the Atomic Cafe, which is kind of a legendary punk hangout. And it was like $5, all you could drink, no age, nobody asked any questions for ID or anything like that. So I got used to that idea, and I kind of wanted to keep that kind of thing going. We would see like Christian death there. Ron Athey, the performance artist, would be like being crucified, while they were playing their set. It was just anything goes. And so that was, for me, kind of inspirational. And so, but that kind of it was really hard to keep it going because of the LAPD and kind of the, rules of the road at that time.
So you were getting cop hassles even at places like that because downtown LA was sort of off the map in those days.
For me, yeah. I mean, I really was discovering it at the same time as we were doing those shows, because I grew up on the West Side, and so I thought it was like this cool, like, urban wasteland,
Yeah.
And but yes, it didn't matter. It didn't matter where you were, somehow they would, get access to, if it was listed in the LA Weekly or if it was a flyer or whatever.
Right.
And just it wasn't always a violent thing like some of the really, really terrible episodes that happened where, cops were really beating the crap out of, kids. But it was just almost like, oh, here we go. Oh, it's midnight. Shit, I thought we were gonna make it till 2, but okay, and you just be shut down.
Right. Well, the thing is, there's a point I think that's kind of interesting where it seems like the hardcore shows get to be really big at places, so they're at, Florentine Gardens or Santa Monica Civic or, these big places. And there's sort of like no-go zones where you just like it's so, I feel like after the Penelope Spheeris's Decline of Western Civilization came out, when that film came out, it seemed like all of a sudden there were all these kids who had no real interest in punk, who were just like, they were high school kids or whatever. And they're coming from OC just to like, blow up bathrooms with cherry bombs and stuff. It was just all these big hardcore shows were crazy.
Right.
But everything sort of had moved to different places because nobody wanted to go to the Whiskey. Nobody, there was that kind of stuff, but nobody was going to. So it was more Al's Bar, the Anti-Club, the Atomic. I mean, places like that, or Grandia Room, El Al Señorial. I mean, just like all these East LA places or downtown LA places. And, and it, because, the Chinatown places stopped really doing shows at a certain point in there, 82 or 83, it seemed like, so everything got really sort of changed. And there was a group of people who the music was sort of informed by punk, but it was punk in the sense that like, it just wasn't, you couldn't call it anything else.
Right.
It didn't really have
See, to me, like, that was, I think, not unique to LA, but it was always there, like, from even when I first discovered, let's say, the first records on, Danger House, or even just listening to this radio show, Rodney on the Rock, that was kind of, a couple hours a week. There was, I think, this idea that punk could be a lot of different things, like Monitor, that was just crazy, trippy stuff, but it was noisy. And so it had elements that turned off regular people that listened to like album radio and stuff like that. But it wasn't one particular genre at all. So that was the stuff that I kind of cut my teeth on from 16 years old on or whatever. So that was kind of what I was interested in. And so when you think about putting on music events, it just didn't seem like that fit with that environment that
people in,
regular rock and roll bands would be playing in.
Mm. No, it's true. I mean, and there was a lot of. Did you ever listen to Meltzer's show, Hepcats from Hell?
Yeah,
I remember it was KPFK, right?
Yeah. It was the one that Andre Enthal then took over once they kicked him off.
Right.
It changed around 81, I think.
That is.
But there was the thing is, because Meltzer had this idea that punk was not rock and roll, like that there was a quality to a band like the Germs or something like that it was disconnected from like rock as rock,
Yeah.
And it kind of was in a weird way. And you're right, whether it was Monitor or there were all these bands in these really like weird, creating this weird kind of like arty music that had a punk maybe kind of energy and was off-putting for Some
Yeah,
sort
I
of,
think I felt like at some point, like late 70s, early 80s, like there could have been this thing where everything diverged, where like punk went off in its direction and rock and roll went off in its direction, but
right.
not actually. I don't know that that actually happened, but I also think, you know, there was definitely people in the UK that I think we were all kind of paying attention to, whether it be Wire, Fall,
Those are the last-
PIL, that were pushing the boundaries from within punk, you know.
Right.
So that was another aspect, or the pop group, you know, and
Right.
and so I know for the Minutemen that was kind of like,
Isn't that all?
you know, like
This isn't Charles.
you had to kind of step up your game, you know, because of what was, you know, the boundaries kept getting further and further out.
Right. So was that, you know, I'm just curious if, you know, there were bands, you think of bands who really like embodied that impulse. You think the Men were sort of the, in a way, the apogee of some of that stuff because they weren't off-putting?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were the most like at the heart of hardcore, being on SST and playing all those shows with Black Flag, but also really abstract. And I mean, they had the energy of punk, but they had the funkiness of, you know, what later became like the Red Hot Chili Peppers and stuff like that. So yeah, I would say that they were super inspirational. But I mean, I think as far as taking things out to the desert, that became also because of Savage Public. Yeah.
But the thing is, I mean, part of the intriguing thing was, as has sort of come up before, was the idea of taking, you know, punk, which is really not, it seems like an urban type of music, and transposing it to nature seems like a really like kind of interest, like a weird thing to do, to take a band, you know, like Einstürzen.
Part of it was, you know, once you start thinking about how does the environment change the perception of the music,
right?
That it wasn't, part of it was about, I felt like there was kind of this transcendent, big kind of like cinematicness to some of this music. And so that it felt wrong to be experiencing it in a little sweaty nightclub, even as great as that experience can be for the right band. You know what I mean?
So Mariska, where were you living out there then?
I was in Highland Park.
Oh yeah.
Which wasn't as trendy back then, like Stuart
They are
living now, but
right.
I was pretty much an Angelino. So
So what were your bands besides, you did SciComm, what else were you in?
I played with a little bit with Dead of Nature, and then Brad and we had a band called Salt. I like the noise stuff better, but then when we get popular,
why she hadn't done that.
What is it?
But yeah,
I think
it's weird.
okay.
Brad was a really good guy. What's he doing now?
Music stuff.
Yeah, but he's doing more pop stuff, isn't he? Sort of. No?
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely got more melodic from what we used to see at the Anti-Club. But
yeah,
I mean, he's done some, I mean, Medicine and then things after that. I mean, he definitely had like a Beach Boys influence, you know?
Right, yeah. He's a super interesting guy. And yeah, Dead of Nature was great.
Yeah.
But you know, the thing is, there was really that whole, I mean, that I was thinking that sort of that nexus, the axis is sort of like the Al's Bar Anti-Club bands. You know, there were really some good bands who didn't seem to play too many other places. You know?
Right.
You know, and it's like, it's funny though, because like, you know, the UCLA thing, I was, you know, Savage Republic obviously came out of the UCLA scene, you know, sort of the Urinals and some other stuff like that. I was always really curious because those guys had all sort of studied with Chris Burden, you know, the performance artist. And I think he was always really encouraging, you know, people to figure out a way to document their art in a way, you know, to, if not commodify it, at least to do something that would make it obvious that they'd done something, you know, they documented in a physical way that would, and I think it was really important in a lot of ways in LA, because it's like now bands that never had a record out, for instance, when you talk about them, it's like, it's hard to remember even really what some of them, you know, were like. And there were there were so many bands that sort of passed through and did a couple of gigs and then never sort of arrived, you know.
Well, I know that there was a direct line from Chris Burden to Bruce Leyssius, who
Right.
was, you know, one of the main people of Savage Republic, because he was going to his class at UCLA, and
Right.
and like this whole idea of I guess, you know, being just very extreme in your work, you know, like and Chris Burden would do these things where, you know, yeah, if I'd never seen the photos of him being crucified on the back of a VW or something, I never would have known that it happened, you know. So it's definitely having both, I think, is important. Although, you know, I think at the time I was more interested in just getting out there and doing these things than the documentation side.
Right.
But other people like totally got it, and it's, you know, like people like Frederick Nilsson, you know, and Mariska, and a lot of, you know, people that were part of the scene were also real photographers. So
Right.
made a big difference.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, obviously, working with Bruce stuff, you put there's a lot of a real heavy visual presence to like your announcements and a lot of that kind of stuff. You guys were working together on some of that stuff at that point, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce was doing, you know, just for people that aren't that familiar with his work, he actually ended up owning a whole letterpress setup, so he could like hand stamp these album covers and stuff like that. And at the time, he didn't have the letterpress himself. He'd go to this place called the Women's Building where he learned how to do that stuff. But it was like a very particular thing where he'd find old letterpress type and so the only thing he did really for our first show was to make the tickets. But the tickets were like these really kind of like deluxe, you know, cool things that went with this sort of, it was a different sensibility than your typical punk rock flyer or, you know, Xerox, you know, ticket or whatever. And so I think it kind of like, our friend Ma said, you know, it was kind of like, it made you in advance think this is going to be something really special and different. And because there was an aesthetic to it. Yeah. So it just sort of, I think none of us would have been doing these things if it weren't for punk rock, but then it kind of like everybody was taking it in different directions.
Right. I mean, what do you think was the most like personally successful, like aesthetically of the outdoor shows that you put on? I mean, is there one that you think really like?
Well, I think the one that was probably the most kind of out there, like the biggest kind of inception or whatever of the idea was probably the second Desert Show with Einsturz and Neubauten and Survival Research Laboratories and Boyd Rice and, you know, Explosions with you know, as the opening act. And so in a sense, and that all kind of really fit together really cohesively. But in another way, like musically, I kind of feel like, you know, the Gila Monster Jamboree with Sonic Youth and the Meat Puppets out in the desert, you know, and everybody, Red Cross, Psychom. I mean, it just probably was the peak of that. We had our act a little bit more together in terms of sound, things like that, and just it was just a great moment, you know.
I mean, I must say the footage of the Einsturz and stuff is just like, it's pretty insane. You know, it's just, Mark Pauline stuff just looks so bonkers out in that kind of thing, because I lived in San Francisco in the late 70s, and so I would see his stuff a lot in different things, and he would do a lot of smaller things, like in just public spaces during the day, like he'd set up in like Union Square Park, and they'd do like anti-Reagan, you know, stuff where there'd be like a boot like kicking Reagan's face, like as it went by on a conveyor belt or something like that. And then they do the bigger ones down sort of in the Mission and south of Mission and stuff like that. But what I mean, that's a really like insane, you know, to look at some of that footage again. You just can't believe that stuff really was going on the way that it was.
And to come back to what Charlotte was saying about, you know, the spirit of the times is like, there was so little planning of that. And I think that's good and bad, but in the good sense, it's like, you know, one of the people from Neubauten said, you know, well, we think Mark Pauline will come, you know, and then like he calls me up and like, well, I could give you gas money, you know, and it's just, and this is all coming together in a couple of days before the show.
Right.
They went all, you know, drove down there, camped out. I mean, everything, it was, so I didn't, yeah, I feel like that kind of spirit, even though we're so much more interconnected, it's hard to imagine, you know, something kind of on that scale, even though it was really small. It's only, you know, maybe 400 and some people,
Right.
but it's still kind of epic. And it's partly just because it just kind of was like snowballing, you know.
Right. Well, you know, the communications was so different then too. You know, there was no internet, there were no cell phones, there was none of that. You know, when you were
Right.
out there, it wasn't like you could call somebody and send them a picture like, oh, look at this thing, it's amazing.
Yeah.
People would hightail it out. It was like you were off the map. You know,
Right.
you had fallen into a random canyon somewhere. It's you know, it takes you know, the speed of communication now and the prevalence of just people knowing as much as they do takes a lot of mystery out of some of these procedures, and it's pretty hard to do something now that is really you know, just really sort of word of mouth, because word of mouth has become electronic, and then it gets echoed so many times and multiplied that it's really hard to.
Yeah, I mean, Mariska and I are still interested in trying to do a desert show, like, you know, small scale, not like a big festival. And obviously everything's, you know, changed even in the last few months in terms of gatherings and stuff like that. But Mariska, you know, you still have attended things out in the desert that are, you know, kind of small and they have a lot of ways of going about it, I guess.
Yeah, you pretty much vet every single person, and there's a rule: you only invite people you would invite into your home. You don't post on social media.
Uh-huh.
Things like that. So, but back then we did live in the moment. We didn't think about sending a picture out to someone. Like I said, you had to wait a week before you even got the film back. So.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think why so much stuff went undocumented, because it took a certain amount of planning. You had to reload you just had to do a lot of physical stuff. You had to focus, you had to watch the lighting, you had to reload your camera, and then you had to like be ready to send it out and have the money to pay for the print. It was just like, it was a big operation.
Yeah.
And you know, because I'll occasionally be looking for photographs of some band that I remember, and man, there are almost none, you know. And it can be really difficult. But then you start to think like, oh, what was involved in doing it? And it was a much bigger thing, you know. And like, there were some people who were, as you said, always taking pictures, or, you know, just like, you know, just keeping tabs on stuff. But it's really gotten so different. It's almost hard to remember what some of that stuff was like in those periods. It's but I do like the fact, you know, as Charlotte was saying, there's really no nostalgia in the film. You know, it's not like, oh, these were the good old days or anything like that. It's just like, man, this was like some weird stuff that was going on. And it happened, you know. And here's what it was like. And it's not, I mean, it doesn't really color it. It just, it presents it sort of in a straighter way than, you know, it's not sentimentalized at all.
Well, I appreciate to me, you know, that means that we all as filmmakers kind of succeeded. And I have to give, you know, everyone involved, Tyler, hubby, who's the editor, you know, credit too, for kind of like, whatever, that was the sensibility that we're trying for. Because I think, you know, growing up in the era when I grew up, like, there was always Woodstock, you know, and it was kind of like, whoa, you guys would never ever do anything as cool as that. And, you know, and so that was kind of like a challenge of like, as being someone promoting shows, so to speak, was like, you know, how can we do something that would be for us a generational equivalent or whatever, but without any of the resources, or, you know, we weren't going to have Jimi Hendrix and all that.
Right.
But at the same time, I just didn't want to have that like patting ourselves on the back feeling, you know. So I just thought, you know, is there a way to just tell the story and let it speak for itself? When you see Untitled Chapter, you really don't need me to tell you, yes, this is really dope.
Right.
Either it is or it isn't. Either you get it or you don't, you know. So yeah, but I do think also like there's an element of it that I hope, and what I've found is that, you know, people do see it and feel like it's a bit of a catalyst or a challenge to say, you know, because in our day, there was stadium rock. You know, people that I went to high school with would go see bands at the Forum, you know, and
Sure.
and I felt like everybody that I knew was reacting against that sensibility. So, you know, Mike Watt always talks about that, you know. So now it's like the festival thing, or at least it was until a couple of months ago. And you know, where you know, these giant events happen and you get to see all these bands, and that's great. But how could people take these ideas and use them for their scene or their music or whatever? So I don't know. That's kind of the feeling we wanted to get from the film.
Also, I wanted to just point out the lack of funds. Like, no one said we're not going to do it because we don't have the money. And no one thought that you had to fundraise first to be able to do what you wanted to do. And that time is really kind of gone. And a lot of my friends are here tonight. They know that I worked with Artist Spaces for a long time ago too. But it's just like this, you know, how I see the pandemic, I see this period of time of letting nature take over, but I also see it as this period of time of, you know, deep, like that German guy said in your movie, I don't know how we got here. You know, like,
yeah.
I literally feel like we all have this collective of, I don't know how I got here, you know, like, I don't know how these things happen, and now it has to happen this certain way, and money has to drive things to such a degree that people feel either outside of it completely or don't want anything to do with it. And there was this time with Artist Spaces across the country where, you know, doing rock and roll shows and putting up art at the same time was just a given. You know, it's just what you did.
I got to give credit to also the record stores back then, you know, which obviously there's less and less of, but I mean, what I learned from, like, kind of my mentor, so to speak, of putting on weird shows was Michael Shepard. And, you know, he put on the Throb and Gristle show that, you know, we showed at the beginning. And there was a lot of things that Michael did that were, you know, maybe difficult, but he put on some amazing events. And the thing was, we would go around to the record stores at the time, like where Byron worked at Rhino, and they wouldn't ask a lot of questions like, do you really have insurance for this? And they'd just be, okay, we'll sell your tickets. Here's your money. And so by the time we actually had to pay the sound guy and rent the school buses, all that stuff, we had money. But when we printed up the flyers, we didn't, which is kind of like a GoFundMe or, you know, a Kickstarter or whatever. But it was much less formalized. You know, we didn't go through any big platform or whatever. But it definitely was like, build it and they will come kind of thing. Did work. I mean, obviously sometimes it all went awry, but you know.
Right. Well, you know, at that time also, I think it's places that were big population centers always had areas that were just poor people or were abandoned, where you could kind of do things that you wanted to do until somebody caught on that you were doing them, then you just have to move on. So and I always feel like now, like cities that people actually want to be in, they don't have any like blighted areas anymore where you could go in and like do something for a night and like nobody's around and nobody's going to care.
Yeah. I mean, I think rent is a huge factor in how much creativity and freedom people have, because you could live in LA in that downtown area. You know, yeah, it was blighted, but it was also like, you know, I was paying $125 a month for part of a big loft space with Bruce and Michael Shepard. And I think that having that time really helps people think of crazy shit to do and pull it off, you know. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think that, yeah, I mean, there was a luxury, I think. You know, it was like New York in the 70s was the whole, like, you know, the way it's depicted in Joker or whatever, you know, it's like, it was kind of a wasteland. And then LA we kind of realized that at a certain point a few years later, that we've got this area. But in terms of going out to the desert, I mean, there's a lot of desert. And I think that opportunity is still there, you know.
Right. Yeah. So if you did another show, what kind of artist would you like to have doing?
Well, you know, I think there's an element of it that I'd like to have, like some people that were part of the original shows, like someone like Mike Watt or Thurston, you know, and then also I'd like to have somebody that represents kind of that sensibility, but much younger, you know, people in their 20s or something like that. And one thing, then there's also the idea of like somebody that I would love to have done a show with that we never were able to because of touring and stuff like that. And so I've actually spoken to Mark Stewart from Pop Crew, and originally they were going to be, you know, here in the fall, and we were thinking maybe, you know, we would do something with them. So, and then also like I'm thinking it'd be really cool to bring a band up from Mexico actually, because you know it's not that far from us here, and kind of a solidarity thing. So you know, if it was the same sort of sensibility again of pushing the envelope, you know, kind of noisy music. So those are some ideas. I'd love to have maybe Ron Athey do something really extreme out there. I don't know. We're still kind of figuring it all out.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it's a good idea. People really need that kind of stuff. You know, it's I sort of feel like things are getting more and more, you know, smoothed over, you know, and streamlined, and everything's, I don't know, it's everything goes in cycles. And I feel like this is a cycle where, you know, I know, like, you know, a lot of the places I can see, you know, a place where a lot of clubs that have been around for a while and stuff like that, doing weirder stuff, are getting shut down just because neighborhoods are changing and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot of like sort of really interesting fringe culture that's getting pushed out, you know, sort of priced out of like areas. And, you know, where does it, I mean, you can keep on moving out and out and out, but you get to a certain point where you're so far away from the center of things that it's hard to get people to show up for things that you're doing. I mean, you have to bust them out. You know, you have to do something like that, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, that's just not something you're going to be able to do on a like every weekend kind of basis. You know what I mean? Those took a lot of planning and sort of the stars aligning and stuff like that. But I mean, I don't know. I trust you to know what's going on out there, Byron. I mean, I still see interesting things like at Cafe Zebulon here when, you know, we still had clubs and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that kind of like more free form kind of things that, you know, like the guys from Sonic Youth are doing now would really fit well into the desert environment, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be cool. I mean, I'd take a trip.
All right. In both senses.
Maybe a spot on the bus. As bus
Yeah.
driver, so.
So I don't know. Are we going to throw? Or do you want to do a question thing? There haven't been
There's
too
some
many
stuff
questions.
on the chat thing over here if you want to just hit us with the.
Yeah, I've looked at some of those. You know, it's like there's a lot of like sort of like spam stuff.
After this. Well,
I didn't really.
Somebody was asking about was it easy to get, and if not, how to use
other modes of conveying the time and moment? What role does music have as a voice in the film?
Okay, so I mean, it's pretty wall-to-wall music. Some of the music is the actual music that's being performed. Sometimes we didn't really have the right footage, or the footage didn't have the right music with it. But I mean, there's one person that I have to always acknowledge who's our archival audio producer, Bob Durkee, because he was out there with his Sony Walkman and he recorded all the shows, and he's an amazing tape archivist. So thanks to him, we were able to digitally put together, you know, the video that we had when sometimes the sound was just almost useless with good. So it all kind of works. And then a lot of the soundtrack, sort of what we call bed music, is from Bruce Leisher, but it's a different group of his called Scenic, which does more kind of, it's inspired by these road trips you do.
Yeah.
And then also Michael Girard from Swans was very generous and let us use Swan stuff where they just took the vocals out and we had it as bed music. And so it's, you know, it's definitely got a lot of music from either the spirit of the people that were doing those shows, what they're doing now, and also just the actual audio. So I don't know, to me, it's a music documentary ultimately, but it's also about kind of just the spirit of the times, you know. Not,
Right. Of course, a lot of people don't realize, you know, Mike Girard was out in LA before he went to New York to do Swan.
Right. And he was one of the two.
He was involved in No magazine.
Right, which I didn't know until that day in 1985 when I met him for the first time. But I'm like, no mag, because that was like one of our big kind of inspirational punk magazines, you know, that and Slash that had this just really messed up imagery, but also really great photography and great layout and all that. So to me, that was kind of what I felt like punk was it wasn't just bands, it was people that were doing photography and all these other things, and it all had kind of a sensibility.
Right. There's another question here. Can you talk about the Herzog movie and your own romantic notions about music and community?
Okay, yeah. So the Herzog movie that is being referred to is Fitzcarraldo, which maybe people are familiar with. It's a great film. I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's about this character who he's this German guy in Brazil in the 19th century, I guess. And he's got this idea that he's going to bring this big like ship across the Amazon, and somehow he's going to make enough money to build an opera house in the middle of the Amazon. And everything goes wrong. Long story short, he's completely broke, but he gets a opera singer, you know, with a bunch of opera, you know, chorus, and they do a concert floating along the Amazon on this boat that he's managed to transport all the way. I don't even know if it's the same boat, but anyway, the idea was that he wanted to do this opera in the jungle, and so it was kind of this idea of fish out of water thing. And so I think for me, it was partly just the epicness of it appealed to me, but also this like, what if we took this really urban music, this, you know, machine performance art stuff that Survival Research Laboratories was doing, and put it into this completely other environment? Mm-hmm. What would happen? What would it be like? So that was kind of a two-part thing, partly just kind of a young person being inspired by Great Werner Herzog movie, but this idea of like, it's wrong, but it's right in terms of the music and the setting, you know?
Right. Somebody else asked, was the Anarchy mobile ever recovered?
That would be a Robert Hecker question. I mean, I never saw it actually. I mean, because I was like already at the show by the time Red Cross got there. And so I only heard about the Anarchy mobile in retrospect. But for those that haven't seen the film, I mean, it was this vehicle that their manager, you know, lined up some kids to drive them from the Burbank airport all the way out to the desert near Joshua Tree, where the show was going to be. And they got lost in the desert, but it was spray painted with Anarchy A's. And that was also like, that's how things were back then. Like there'd be some person with a, you know, fucked up car with an Anarchy sprayed on it, and they would drive you out to the desert, and you just kind of rolled with it. And you know that. So I thought it was also kind of, you know, representative of what was going on back then. But I had no idea they were lost in the desert. There was a lot of controversy about it, and you know, were they just lying low to be rock stars so they could headline, or
yeah.
Anyway, so I just like kind of the humor of us just not really having it together, but then the ultimate result was really amazing. So.
Right. And somebody else asked, did you run into any difficulty with rights clearances?
Well, I mean, I got to be honest, you know, when you make a documentary film, there's always a lot of headaches with rights and things like that. But I think ultimately, because of working with good people that, you know, whether it be the music supervisor, Sean, or people that are in the film, like Adam Wolf, who's a music licensor, eventually we got everything cleared, and all the photography, you know, people were really, really generous about it. I don't know, like, it's a lot of work, but it's all done, just for the record.
Right. There's one for Mariska. How do you think the punk scene and its photography changed the general world of photography? Or do you?
Well, I wasn't so much published. There's Ed Culver. I don't know if anyone knows him. Mm-hmm. Naomi Peterson. For archival reasons. I mean,
you know, Glenn Friedman did a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up looking at Rolling Stone covers and
Uh-huh.
those pictures. I don't know.
Is that what you were thinking of doing? your, your own version of Rolling Stone cover?
To be published, you'd have to think Life magazine, things like that. You didn't. Now you can publish, self-publish everywhere on Instagram. So
it's true.
I don't know. I just can't remember what it was like back. That was 30 years ago.
Right. Well, you know, everybody was doing, the thing that's interesting then is everybody really was doing black and white photography because color processing was such an expense and a pain. And, you know, I think there's a certain aesthetic to when you're working in black and white. I think that has a real different quality to it, because if you shoot in color, then you're really just like capturing life. You really, as soon as you go to black and white, you're interpreting it somehow. You're changing it into, you know, just light and dark.
I was really into Diane Arbus at the time. So
right.
Capturing moments like that.
Sure.
Big thing.
But do you still do photography?
No, but I've started because of Facebook. When we started a Facebook page and people started sending theirs in, it made me kind of start looking for my photos, and
right.
I bought my first digital camera. So yeah.
Oh, good.
Sort of sparked an interest again.
Right. So do you shoot in black and white or color?
Oh, well, you can turn the color down now. So
yeah, I know. But do you, or do you go with color?
I like color.
Yeah, you know, color. It's too real. But there's another question here that I'm not sure I understand. It says, this is the first time I saw BIPOC, BIPOC punk kids in existence.
I'm assuming that's people of color. I'm not sure what the B and the I stand for. But.
Yeah.
Or is it biopic? No.
No, I think it's
people of color.
But,
punk kids in existence. Imogen and its testimonies I had not seen since your film. Can you share why you think this scene was as inclusive as it was?
Well, biracial.
Oh, right.
Okay. Okay.
Well, Linda Kite can probably answer that. But there were a lot of Latino bands. It was the Bags, Zeros,
right.
The Plugs.
Brat.
Okay, so somebody just put Black Indigenous people of color. So all of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Valerie.
Okay.
Well, for me, I think it was partly that I didn't feel like the punk scene in films had really been kind of acknowledging of that, and because it was LA partly, but also I just think that you know, I mean, it felt worth addressing because you could sort of think, oh well, this was just a sort of indulgent suburban white thing, but in fact, my experience of it never really was that way. You know, even going back to, I don't know, there was bands like the Zeros that were Latino, and you know, Alice Bag obviously still at it, and
you know, Carla
our friends. You know, I mean, everybody was kind of, you know, honestly, there weren't that many punks, and everybody was kind of the outsiders at their high school and whatever. So when we got together at shows from whatever part of the city, whatever racial background, whatever, you know, gender, you know, there's a lot of like kind of fluid gender people that like Chandelier that, you know, was a big part of our film. And so I just felt like that was the reality of it. And so we should show that, you know.
Right. No, it's true. I mean, that's something that doesn't, it's something that gets lost, I think, when people who focus on sort of the more jock kind of like element of the punk thing. Because it was really like, you know, the freaks and geeks who were the main part of the crowds for a lot of these things that weren't really the sort of testosterone festivals of like, you know, going to a big hardcore show and you know, just like pounding each other, you know.
I mean, I have to say, I enjoyed all that. Also, like, I would still go see people like Suicidal Tendencies at the Olympic Auditorium.
No, I mean, I would go out to Godzilla's all the time, you know, which was out in Sun Valley, man. It was a weird place, but like, you know, you really didn't want to be up front or close to up front for, you know, when somebody was playing, because it was just like, it was really like, you know, elbows everywhere, you know, just elbows and feet. It was a real bummer.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, like I felt like there was people doing that kind of promoting well, you know, like Golden Voice did a good job of that, you know, the Youth Brigade thing, you know, they covered that.
UIO, yeah.
So,
Right.
yeah. So when, who now do the punk rock bowling festival, I guess. But anyway, so for me, it was like, what about like a platform for this, the weirder edge of punk rock, or you know, where industrial and punk kind of meet, and like you mentioned, Nervous Gender, you know, I mean, that was just like sexually provocative, racially mixed, just the whole thing, and it was noisy, and there was no, again, like just electronic music, but it had the like punk rock energy. So I don't know, I just sort of was like, we were used to that, like people like Mariska and I, that was kind of what you would go see on the weekends or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you know, when it came to putting the film together, that was an element of it that I just kind of wanted to make sure we touched on. Yeah.
Right. Let's see. Trying to see if there's other. Well, I mean, that seems. So I don't know. That seems like most of the questions that people had put up. I don't know if we want to throw things open to the floor, or see if people.
However you guys usually do it
Yeah.
works for me.
Right. Yeah.
Well, if anybody has a question they'd like to ask directly, you can raise your hand and we'll go find you. But also it's close to 6, or it is 6.
Yeah.
And I think, I guess I get to have the last question, and it's hard for me not to think about this time, right? And I just wonder, like, with the pandemic and with everything put on hold, and music having such a role for all of us. Everybody in this room loves music in a really deep way. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about that. Like, are people, like, is it just too early to even speculate, or does it feel like something's going to happen?
For me, I feel like, I mean, this is such a big event for all of us. So, I mean, we're living through like a really interesting and weird time, that something is going to come out of it, but I can't personally predict what that will be. I do feel like there will be maybe less of a desire to go out to these giant festivals when, you know, there's so many, you know, issues about health and stuff like that. But I mean, as far as doing smaller scale things, I mean, I guess that's what my focus is what the future of that kind of thing will be. And I think they'll hopefully always be there, you know, a place for that. I'm not sure what will change, you know, yeah, I don't really know if I have the answer to that, but, you know, maybe this will be one of those tectonic moments where you look back and you go like, wow, music's really different after that. But so far, I'm not feeling that. I don't know.
Can I just say that I absolutely love the documentary and found it fascinating. I was raised in LA, grew up right around that time, and was going to university when all this great stuff was happening. So that sucks. I'm gonna miss that whole scene. But I absolutely loved it. I was fascinated by it. I know that, you know, because I know the geography, I have a sense of the city and the locations that you're talking about. So it's kind of, for me, it felt like a secret history of LA in that time, and kind of a geography and a history of how culture and cultural experimentation, art, for me, it was really art experimentation, can find its way to secret places to do what it needs to do. You know, people needed to go to the desert to, you know, find this harbor, this enclave where they could be somewhat free of the police and that kind of pressure, but also to have that, which I think is documented beautifully in the film, to kind of almost go on that voyage, take that bus trip, take that trip to kind of unmoor yourself from everyday reality and enter that kind of creative void of the desert and the light and the sound, the nature, the quiet, all of those things to allow for a space of experimentation and art. That's really seemed to me what was going on, is you had both a communal and an individual kind of expressivity going on, and changes in perception, everything from couples kind of cementing a relationship for a lifetime in those moments, because they're able to. There's a beautiful quote in there. I think it was from one of the Einstürzende Neubauten musicians, where he talked about permitting the audience a space for self-reflection, that the music created the ability for the audience to reflect on their own selves. And you had some great quotes from people who seem to be going through that very process and the experience of that community and of the art that was going on. So anyway, I just thought it was a fascinating, beautiful film, and I hope it gets to see a lot of, it gets exposed to a lot of audiences, because it was really fantastic.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you got all that out of it. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I guess that's one of those questions that's sort of like a comment also, but yeah, it felt like it was a special time. I think that there was, a lot of I keep coming back to this idea of spontaneity, but I also, there's this idea of community, and I think that that's something that, people just didn't ask a lot of questions about, like, hey, do you want me to help, take tickets on the bus, or, move the generator or whatever. And I think all that kind of spirit really makes things work, and it takes it outside of the sort of big entertainment industry feeling. And there's no, there's no reason that we have to be limited by just being consumers,
Right.
So that was kind of, I think, important, is just that people jump in and no one person makes something like this happen. So, I think it's the same with the film as it was for the original events. It was all these different creative people kind of getting involved in something. So yeah, it's cool that got through, and that we were able to get that across.
Well, it's funny, because it seemed in both the film and the voiceovers, and even here tonight, I know as you're talking about that that odd balance between the planned and the unplanned, like sort of, well, there's a downside to being unplanned, but when you see the level of the improvisation, the willingness to take risks, I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? Get on a bus and trusting. Get on a bus, go out to the middle of the desert where it's 100 degrees, who knows what, in the middle of the day, and trust that you're going to be okay.
Right.
And kind of commit yourself to that moment and to that activity and to that, somehow it's kind of like, let's make a treehouse. It's like, we're going to make this thing happen. We're going to build it, and somehow it's going to all congeal. And it's fantastic. It's like, it is that kind of that moment that comes and goes, and that moment's remarkable when it happens, right? You guys really didn't know, is it going to happen or not? And
I just want to come back to what Byron was saying about Chris Burden, that, again, like Chris Burden would do these sort of spontaneous things, and there was an element of risk, if you got, or same with survival research laboratories, if you got too close, you could get burned, you could get hurt. And I do miss that, because I think our world has just become a lot more litigious, and it's a lot less idea that people have to take responsibility for their own sort of well-being and stuff like that, because you need that little bit of like room for error, I think, to do things that are really taking you out of your normal everyday reality. So but also, like, yeah, people were willing to jump on the bus. I think some of that was youth also. The youth.
The youth.
That we, so I'm optimistic that if, a new generation of people see something like this, they might take it in their own direction, because it's just easier to be that way when you're young, I think.
Well, I know just from my daughter and her boyfriend's big skater culture guy. And anyway, yeah, I mean, that's a heroic time to them. I mean, and they really, you know, they eat up the movie and they eat up the bands and they want more. And they, you know, and they're also very anti-consumerist in the way that they think about their own lives and their own futures. So yeah, I think it's really hopeful movie for a lot of people.
And just one quick thing, there was someone that asked about the site specificness, and I don't know, feel like something, yeah, when we did our first desert show, that was the big shift, but then we also did one on a boat in San Pedro with the Minutemen, which is where they come from, going around the harbor. And so I just, yeah, that was a big part, that became a big part of what Desolation Center was to me, was to combine the environment with the music and with kind of even the backstory in the sense of the Minutemen, you know, growing up in the harbor and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know, that's something that I think I always just get more out of performance if it's somewhere where you don't expect to see it, or, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay. Do we have any more questions or comments? Well, I think we can all say we survived being bombed now. Like, you know, World War II has nothing over us anymore. And here we are hunkered down and we survived the bomb. And it was really, really delightful. And I have big thank you to Brian for speaking. That was so lovely. And big thank you to Byron for coming on. We have Byron. And it's just been fantastic for me. And I hope for many of you too, because this movie just meant so much to me to be able to see it. And it means so much to me to know you people. And we have more stuff coming up. So give me a second, I'm going to tell you about it. Next, we have this incredible, I'm going to say what we have coming up, and I have to come back to thank yous because I am very thankful. But the coming ups are, we have this incredible young writer, Jess Anthony, and she has an incredible title, Enter the Aardvark. And she's been a bridge policeman in Croatia and Poland, I think, and she's also been a butcher, and she's been everything, and she's an incredible writer, and I think she's incredibly young too. And then after Jess Anthony, that's Thursday coming up, then Sunday we have Gregor Huebner. He's a great musician from Germany. He does jazz, he does classical compositions. He's a teacher at Stuart, and he's also a teacher at Manhattan College of Music. And he's wonderful. We only let wonderful people on this show. And then we have Mitchell Razor the following Thursday, and he does this in very deep kind of connective discussion and slides about Patti Smith and the punk scene. So let me just say again, before we unmute everybody, I want to say thank you very much, Mariska. It's very, very deep for me to meet you and have these wonderful conversations and to experience your wisdom and your whiskey. And then thank you very much, Stuart, for coming on, and thank you for letting me invite you on. And then thank you, Byron, for making things go so smoothly, even when things were really awful. You just kept us going.
We didn't see back in the day. So, well, thank you, Charlotte, and obviously Byron and Mariska, and you know, Jocelyn and Bill for having us. And you know, this is the first for me, so it was quite an experience. And really thanks to everybody for tuning in. And yeah, it's a really interesting experience. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Speedwell.
Thank you. Fabulous film. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I'm muting everybody. Here we go.